Welcome everyone to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on the introduction to the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew. So last we met, we were discussing the introduction to the book of Mark, where we looked at things like authorship and setting, overarching story, things of that nature. Also, things about how the book came to be and in terms of its cultural setting. And so today we're going to do the same thing with the book of Matthew. So Matthew, in terms of its structure, is substantially longer than the book of Mark. And it begins with 2 chapters about Jesus' ancestry, conception, and infancy, which Mark lacked. It also ends with a full chapter about Jesus' return from the grave, the resurrection, and then his final commissioning of the disciples. So in Matthew, we have these nice bookends about his birth and then also about the resurrection. Now, Matthew typically is divided into 5 large sections based on what are known as the discourse material or sermons. Discourse just means dialogue, talking, essentially is giving a teaching. Okay, and so the first of these is chapters 5 through 7. This is the Sermon on the Mount. The second is chapter 10, the sending of the 12. The third is chapter 13, parables of the kingdom. The fourth is chapter 18, further kingdom parables and teachings. And the final is chapters 23 through 25, the Olivet Discourse. Now, that's the general breakdown and structure. Each of these ends with when Jesus finished saying these things. From that time on, Jesus began too. And so with that, you can kind of get this feeling of, okay, we really are transitioning after each of these. And another way to think about this is dividing into 3 sections, kind of along the lines of what I was talking about earlier. We have an introduction of the birth narratives, the main body of his life and ministry, and then the extended conclusion or climax, given the passion narrative and the resurrection events, or just the resurrection events, however you'd like to view it. If you take a look at the discourses and the narratives, they do tend to highlight a common theme. So, for example, you have the beginning or body of the gospel, and you have the preaching, teaching, and healing. And this is kind of captured in Sermon on the Mount's teaching, and then there's 8 to 9. Chapters 8 to 9 are many healing miracles. Okay. Then you have the second sermon, commissioning and hostility, and the narratives that accompany that tell about the animosity that was experienced by them. Chapter 13 sifts listeners into outsiders and insiders, and this is where you see around these areas is where you see the rejection of Jesus and the acceptance by some Gentiles. Chapter 18 is where you see the devotion, where Jesus is devoted to the disciples and the foundation of the church. And so you have coupling that, warnings of God's judgment on unbelief, and then the final chapters of the passion, death, and resurrection, and the end times narrative of the Olivet Discourse. So it's kind of interesting. There's a number of different ways you can sort of structure Matthew, and those are just some of them. And so now let's talk about the general flow of the entire book. So it begins with Jesus' ministry. You see his origin and his preparation for ministry. The second main area is the development of Jesus' ministry. You see first Jesus' authority in preaching and healing. Comes the introduction, the paradigmatic preaching, the difficult sayings, and the Sermon on the Mount, and then paradigmatic healing, the difficult healings. You then see rising opposition to Jesus' mission, the opposition predicted for the disciples' mission, and the opposition experienced in Jesus' mission. You then see the progressive polarization of the response to Jesus. Polarization is explained in the kingdom parables, and it's enacted from Jew to Gentile. You see it all work out. And finally, the climax of Jesus' ministry, which focuses on the coming death and resurrection. The implications of this for discipleship, he corrects their misunderstandings. And the implications for the church, being in humility and forgiveness. And then you see the road to Jerusalem, impending judgment on Israel, true discipleship versus the harsher condemnation for the Jewish leaders, and judgment on the temple, but also on the nations. And finally, Jesus' ultimate destiny, the passion, crucifixion, and resurrection. And so that kind of sums up the Gospel of Matthew. Now, in terms of theology, there are a number of different views that it presents of Jesus. First, as a teacher. He is the consummate teacher. There are many similarities to Moses and Israel in Exodus in here. You see Jesus' new moral demands come with a new empowerment for obedience that was not previously available. You see him mentioned as the son of David, the king and the royal Messiah. The son of David is again speaking to his Jewish lineage of the king and the Messiah. It's the expectation that he would come from the house of David. Herod, for instance, feared a literal king would usurp his power, so there's no doubt about it. Jesus was a king. You see this idea of the Son of God in elevated or deified terms, Matthew's use of the term more closely approaches the full-fledged divinity that later creeds and confessions are going to make very explicit. You see a relationship of him to wisdom in John 12:42 and 13:54. And you see him as Lord, which is the correct title for full-fledged disciples, to call him Lord, especially when in need of aid. And you see him being worshipped, but then worshiping the Lord during his lifetime as well. Now, some other interesting themes you have: the particularism and universalism in the gospel offer according to scriptures. So Matthew's a very Jewish gospel. That's the particularism, right? It's very Jewish. There's the mission to the Jews. But this foreshadows the Gentile mission clearly. The fulfillment of scriptures is a central piece of this gospel, and there's one of the main tensions of the entire gospel is the Jewish mission versus the multi-ethnic mission. And this is one of the reasons why people don't like Jesus, is because he's incorporating the Gentiles into the mission. And so pre-death and resurrection, Jesus was sent to the Jewish people, but after the rejection and passion events, the gospel goes to everyone. Now, you also see a little bit about the discipleship and the church. This has a more positive picture of the disciples. It mentions the church 3 times, and it's the only gospel to do so. You also see conflict with Jewish authorities. There's many hostile encounters with Jewish authorities presented in Matthew's gospel. Now, what about the circumstances? Well, Matthew wrote to Jewish Christians. People thought this was the eastern part of the empire. So what type of situation within Judaism would have provoked this gospel? Well, it's thought that it would be a Judaism on the verge of, or just recovering from a substantial break, or Christianity essentially coming from a substantial break from Judaism as a whole. Remember that up until mid-60s to 70s, the Jews and the Jews and the church were still kind of together to an extent. And it wasn't until after the destruction of the temple, after the fleeing of the Christians from Jerusalem, that there really was this massive divide. And it was no longer a Jewish sect, but a full-fledged other religion. And so after the destruction of the temple, you see Rabbinic Judaism increase, and that was the legacy of the Pharisees. And you see Christian Judaism, and that lasted to about mid-second century. But the tensions were high between these two groups. And Matthew's gospel is a response as well to the definitive rejection of Israel's majority to Jesus. So you see predictive prophecy in there, which allows for a pre-70 date. Irenaeus stated that Matthew wrote, quote, while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel and founding the church in Rome. That'd be in the 60s AD. Earlier dating, you have things like offerings and temple tax and Sabbath keeping. But after 70 AD, none of those were practiced. So why even mention them? Because people wouldn't even have a reference. You have the stress of the antagonism of the Sadducees in an era where they would have been abolished if it was post-70. So my argument would be it's probably 60s, probably after Mark, at least in the version that we have. There's some thought as well that there was a proto-Matthew that was drafted by Matthew, and then he essentially took that and formed it in full-fledged gospel. We'll talk about that in a moment. So in terms of authorship, the thought is that it was Matthew, Levi, a tax collector, and one of the 12 apostles. Papias actually has our best statement on this, quote, Matthew composed or compiled his gospel or sayings in the Hebrew Aramaic language, dialect or style, and everyone translated or interpreted as they were able. Now this leads to some interesting possibilities. The thought might be that, well, maybe Matthew had this sort of proto-Matthew, if you will. Some of them even called this Q, oddly enough. But a proto-Matthew that was in Aramaic, that was going around, and then it wasn't until later that essentially he made the full gospel that we now know, probably in Greek, because it does not seem to be translated from Aramaic. But again, we don't know what Papias was necessarily referring to here, except that Matthew definitely wrote a gospel, and that it seemed to be in Hebrew or Aramaic, which is kind of interesting. Some issues with this. Let's talk briefly about the issues here. The issues. Well, one reason why people try to say Matthew didn't write it is because it's very anti-Jewish. The problem is Matthew was already alienated from his contemporaries by his former profession. Just being a tax collector would have made Matthew very anti-Jewish. Second, some people argue that it has a theological incompatibility with other Jewish Christian sources. However, it has compatibility with James. And the issue, well, for example, there's issues with the compatibility with James, but not all Jewish Christianity is monolithic in its structure. So you're going to see different ways of talking about things. So that's not really an issue. They would argue that Matthew 13:52 is a self-reference to the author as a Christian scribe, not a tax collector, but that's not really a clear reference. There's the, quote, improbability of Matthew living beyond 85, but that only assumes that it was a late date that it was written. We argue that it was written in the 60s. And finally, they argue that there is an unlikelihood of an apostle borrowing from a non-apostolic author like Mark. But again, we have to recognize that Mark sourced Peter, and again, Matthew doesn't overly depend on Mark. So all of those issues really aren't really truly issues. And so that's really it for tonight. It's a short little thing. These next couple are probably going to be like this, just little briefs, maybe 10, 15-minute total briefs. So again, some other final thoughts though on the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew is very Jewish. A lot of the references are Jewish, and actually I would argue that when trying to interpret Matthew, it's when you take those Jewish references and try to make them apply to everyone that you actually run into problems. The second issue with Matthew is that it's very eschatological. There is a lot of end times content in Matthew. It almost bleeds off the page throughout most of the gospel. And so if you've got an issue with end times theology or eschatology, if you've got a faulty eschatology, you're going to have a harder time interpreting Mark, or you're going to come to some wrong conclusions about it. And additionally, I would argue that in terms of the four Gospels, and this is just sort of a comment that I've made because people will often ask me, Pastor Chris, what Gospel should I read first, or what Gospel should I go through with someone for discipleship? And I say, well, Matthew's a difficult one to start on because of its Jewishness. You're going to have to do a lot of explaining in terms of its Jewishness in order for it to make sense. It's very eschatological, so it's got a different focus. John is probably the hardest one. It's the most theological, and it's the one that's going to require the most explanation. Now you're left with Mark and Luke in terms of a first gospel to go through and give the life of Jesus. And I would say this. I like Luke because it's all organized, it's all in chronological order, it's got all of the events. But I will say this, given that it's got all the events, you don't get maybe quite as much detail. Mark doesn't have all the events, but you get a lot more detail. So kind of take your pick. Both of them are good. I like Luke. It has a more clear intro with the birth narrative and end. But there are still points of Mark. Mark actually serves a lot of good points because it includes a lot more in the stories that it does tell than virtually any of the other Gospels. So you get a lot more detail. So even a combination of reading through Luke and looking at the stories in greater detail in Mark could be a good idea. And with that, that's really all I have to say tonight. It's a short, like I said, a short talk tonight. Next week we'll be picking up with the Gospel of, or next 2 weeks, we'll be picking up with the Gospel of Luke. I hope you look forward to that and enjoy that. And thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church. I'll go ahead and put the Zoom link in here for us, and I'll do my final sign off. Actually, just sign off now. Thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church. Boy, that was a horrible sound. Thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. All right. And we'll go ahead and give our link. Give me 1 second. We'll get our link. All right, here's our Zoom link. All right, so if anybody would like to join, feel free, and I'll go ahead and end the talk here. Okay, thank you guys so much for joining.